Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to editing. Now this is a video lots of people have been asking for because people find it quite hard to analyse editing with things like unseen products and even their set texts. Often editing is something that is invisible and it's, you know, a lot of good editors design their editing to be invisible and it doesn't always work that way, but it does mean that we're not necessarily programmed to notice it all the time. So I've tried to do a video here about different and common editing techniques that you might spot either in your set texts or in unseen products, and maybe why they're used or what they connote, how they affect or impact the audience, and hopefully this is helpful. If you've got any questions, just drop them in the comments below and I shall see if I can answer them.
Okay, so a cut is literally a really simple change from one shot to another. It's the most common editing technique that is just literally changing from one shot to another. And the point of this, I suppose, is to keep the pace going of a scene, to just keep the drama going. Because if you stay on one shot for too long, it gets a bit boring. It allows the editor to cut to another angle, so maybe perhaps shows the audience something else. And it allows you to cut something out of a shot without it being obvious, because you can cut up a shot and put in another angle and then go to a wide shot and then onto a close-up, and that allows you to chop up your scene into chunks without the audience really noticing. So a cut is the most common editing technique you'll come across. A simple change from one shot to another. Shot reverse shot. This is when an editor cuts back and forth between one person and another, normally whilst they're interacting or talking in some way. So for example, you might see one person's face whilst they're talking, and then you see the other person's face, and often they will go back and forth during that conversation. It's good for showing conversations and interactions. It's often a bit more interesting than just showing one shot with both people in that one shot. So for example, a two shot. So it can be a bit more interesting, and it makes it a little bit more snappy and fast paced, going back and forth rather than just having one shot on the screen. But often it's also used to connote that two people are quite separate and different, because we are literally seeing them in different shots. It tells us that they're separate. Whereas an editor could make a decision just to keep on screen, for example, the wider shot showing both people. That might suggest that they were, you know, linked and friendly and they were talking quite happily amongst one another. But actually, shot reverse shot, where you're going back and forth, adds a bit of conflict. So if you want to show two people as having some kind of conflict or difference between them, a shot reverse shot is quite good. An eyeline match is where we see a character and then the editor cuts to show us what that character is seeing or looking at. It makes it clear who or what a character is looking at, and that's quite useful sometimes because it helps to kind of tell us a bit more about what they're seeing, and it puts us in that character's shoes. If we know what they're looking at, it helps us to understand what's going on, and it engages us a little bit more. A graphic match is quite an artistic shot, really. It's where you cut from one shot to another one, that both those shots look visually similar to one another. So, for example, the one that you are seeing on screen at the moment is quite a famous one from the film Psycho, where you are seeing the character in the opening scene's eye, a close-up on her eye, and then the shot changes to the plug hole and the water going down the plug hole, and that's also round like her iris of her eye. So they look quite visually similar. It could be in terms of shape, like that one was two round visual objects, an eyeball and a plug hole. It could be two shots where maybe there's similar colours or, you know, a similar pattern or design going on to show some kind of link or similarity between two different things, people or situations. An action match is where the editor cuts from a shot with some kind of movement in it to another shot of that same action from a different angle in order to make it look like one smooth movement. So, for example, if you saw a person on the screen drawing a gun out of a holster, you might cut to a different angle. They would continue to draw that gun out of the holster, hold it up, point it, and fire it. So it would look like one smooth motion, even though in reality, those two or three shots would have been filmed separately. So, you know, the director and producer and the cast would have had to have done that shot 3 or 4 times. The editor cuts it together to make it look like one smooth motion. And that's really good for keeping the audience engaged in the scene. It's more interesting and it adds to the realism or natural feel of the piece because it allows us to feel like it's one smooth motion. Nothing is interrupting that movement. So it helps us to feel like that movement is real. Jump cuts, one of my favorite things. They are something that really stands out to me on a screen, but not everyone always recognizes them and they're not used that often. So when they are used, there's normally a quite creative reason for why they've been used. It's where the editor cuts a piece of a shot out, but doesn't use anything like another angle to cover the edit. And that means that the person that they are showing on the screen seems like they're jumping around a little bit. It's quite noticeable for the most part. You see it quite a lot in online media because they only ever tend to film from one angle, like a vlogger. And you'll see this in a whole range of my other videos on my channel. I jump cut quite a lot simply because I only film from one angle, so I don't really have anything to cover up the edits. So it's quite common in online media, but if you see it in something like an advert or a film or a music video, whatever it might be, there's normally a much more creative reason for it. Sometimes it can make something seem quite amateur. It's something that professional filmmakers tend to try and avoid doing unless there's a real creative reason for it. The creative reasons are sometimes because they want to make something seem chaotic or crazy or repetitive. If you're seeing somebody jump around on the screen, it does seem quite nuts. So if you want to connote that somebody is losing their mind or a bit chaotic, for example, then jump cutting is quite useful. And because the audience tend to notice these jump cuts, it means they notice the editing, and that takes away some of the realism of the piece. Crosscutting, which is sometimes also called parallel editing, depending on who you talk to, is where an editor cuts from one scene that is taking part in one location to another scene that is taking part in another location. And sometimes they go back and forth between these two scenes. And it ends up making it look like the scenes might be happening at the same time, but just in different locations. So in the example that I'm showing you on the screen now, this is from the film Inception, and you can see that the editor is cross-cutting between the interior scenes of a character kind of having a fight in a hallway and the exterior shots of people in a car kind of driving quite erratically. And the cross-cutting between the two is very clearly to help us to understand that the two things are happening at the same time, and to help us to understand that there is a link between what is happening in the car and what is happening in the hallway. And cross-cutting often keeps an audience interested in a scene, because if you cross-cut back and forwards between two different storylines or scenes or characters, an audience often feel like they want to keep watching for whichever scene is they're most interested in. They want to watch for that one to come back on the screen. So it's quite a good way of keeping your audience engaged in something. A cutaway, which is sometimes called an insert shot, is when an editor adds in a short shot of something relevant to break up a longer shot or scene. This is really hard to explain, but hopefully if I give you a visual example. This example that I've got here, it says that when two people are having a conversation, for example, you might add in a shot of their hands or their phone or something that they're doing at the same time. So maybe two people are in the kitchen talking. You might show a shot of them stirring the saucepan on the side at the same time as, you know, we're cutting between their conversations. So adding in a kind of close-up is normally a close-up. It doesn't always have to be. Adding in something which is relevant to the scene, but it helps to break up the shots. You know, visually, it can be there to cover a cut. You know, for example, if you wanted to cut something, a longer shot up, you might use a cutaway in order to hide that edit. So you didn't have to jump cut, for example. You might use a cutaway to help you do that. It does help sometimes to show the audience that something is relevant to the main action. A dissolve is a type of editing transition. It's when two shots are put next to each other in a timeline and the editor kind of blends them together for a moment during the transition. So it's not a simple cut. They kind of blend together until the second shot is on the screen. And it's quite useful for making it seem like time has passed. It slows down that transition, whereas a cut happens quite quickly. A dissolve tends to be a little bit slower. So it makes it seem like time has passed, and it links two shots or scenes together. So it kind of helps us to see perhaps there might be a link between those two things. Don't see it very often in TV or film anymore, but it can happen, and it's useful to work out why if you do spot one. A fade in is very similar to a dissolve. A dissolve, if you remember on the previous slide, was when two shots kind of blended together. A fade is when there's a solid colour and a shot. So rather than two separate shots, it's a solid colour. So a solid colour, like a black screen, for example, slowly changes into a shot. It doesn't have to be a black screen. It could be a different colour, and different colours might connote different things as well, but also makes it seem like time has passed. And if you fade in from a solid colour, so fading in from white or black, for example, it often makes it seem like this is the beginning of something. Something has just started. So you might get a fade in at the beginning of a film, for example. Likewise, you can get fade out, and that is when a shot slowly blends into a solid colour screen. So, for example, a black screen. And again, different colours of the screen might connote different things. It again makes it seem like time is passing, but if you fade out, it seems like something is ending, and that's why you often get like a fade out at the end of maybe a TV program or a film, because it does help us to kind of think that something is finishing. A wipe is a really unusual type of shot. So there's lots of different types of wipe that you can get, and I'm going to show you some of the different types of wipe on the screen now. But essentially, it's where one shot appears to be wiped or pushed off the screen or onto the screen by something else, by another shot. Sometimes it's just a straight line where the whole shot seems to push or be pushed off of the screen or onto the screen. Sometimes they will use shapes like a star wipe, or you have something called a blind wipe that looks like the blinds you get at windows. It can make something seem quite fun or comic because it does stand out. It definitely takes away the realism because we kind of tend to notice them. But it, depending on the wipe, because it's one shot is being pushed off a screen by another one, it can connote that someone or something is being pushed around or wiped away, manipulated, or it might also connote that someone is being manipulative. So it's worth having a think about scenes that you might have seen with a wipe and think about whether or not it might connote some kind of manipulation. Superimposition, if something has been superimposed on something else, it's where something, for example, graphics, is placed on top of another shot so you can see both on screen together. That is often because you want to show that the superimposed element, whether that is graphics or whatever it might be, it shows that that is important information. For example, you might superimpose somebody's name on top of a news program so that we can see who they are and what their job title is. You might superimpose a company logo on top of an advert, and that shows that information is important. It adds extra information for the audience, and it connects those two layered elements together. It shows us that, it helps to perhaps anchor the meaning. A bit like a caption for a photograph. If you superimpose words or graphics, for example, on top of an image or a shot, it helps us to understand a little bit more maybe about those two elements. Now, long takes. One take, when we talk about a take, we mean like a particular shot. If you have one take on a screen, that is where you leave one shot on the screen and you don't cut to anything else for quite a while. So that we describe that as one take, one small little snippet on your timeline, that's a take. If it's a long take, then that means that take is perhaps longer, that shot is perhaps on screen for a longer amount of time than some of the other shots before the editor chooses to cut to something else. And that often slows the pace down of whatever you are watching. It might make it seem quite relaxed. So if you're wanting somebody to seem very chilled out, you might leave the shots on screen for a very long period of time before you change to another shot. However, if you leave the shot on the screen for quite a long time, there is a period where it becomes uncomfortable for an audience. And obviously, depending on what is in the shot, what is actually happening, it can feel quite awkward. we can't look away. There's nowhere for the audience to look to. We can't avoid what is on the screen because it's not going away anytime, anywhere soon. So if you leave a take on the screen for a long time before cutting away, it can be quite uncomfortable. By contrast, if you use short takes, i.e. you have lots of short clips in your timeline, that means though those shots will only be on screen for a short time before it cuts to something else. That speeds up the editing. It's fast-paced editing. It adds drama. It makes something seem fast-paced. It makes it seem exciting and dramatic. Slow motion is when a shot or a whole scene has been physically slowed down in the editing program. And that is often quite good for making it seem quite dramatic. So if there is some kind of very overly dramatic scene where somebody gets shot, you might show the scene, slow the scene down. I can't talk today. So you might slow the scene down so you see the bullet in slow motion hitting the person and then falling to the floor and then somebody else screaming. If you see that in slow motion, it might highlight the drama and the danger that person is in. Sometimes they do it for romantic scenes as well. It can seem quite romantic if you slow something down. It helps to draw the audience's attention to every detail. So if there's something that is incredibly detailed happening on the screen, sometimes slow motion helps the audience take all that detail in. Split screen, a little bit different to when we talked about superimposition earlier. Superimposition is where you layer one shot on top of another or one graphic on top of another shot. Split screen is when two or more shots or scenes play on the screen at the same time, but in separate sections of the screen. So maybe half your screen on the left is one scene and half the screen on the right is another scene. It suggests those two scenes are happening at the same time. So, for example, if we saw two people on a phone together, you might see one person on the phone on the left and the other person on the phone on the right. It might suggest they're talking to each other. It allows us to see the action in two locations at once, which might help us to understand what's going on. It links people or places in those separate scenes together. The only reason you would use split screen is to either highlight a complete contrast between what's going on or to show that they are very similar in some way. And it takes away the realism. If the audience can see the editing clearly, i.e. the screen has been split in half and they're both on screen at the same time, that is not realistic. And so it takes away the realism. And often it's used for things like comic effect. You might see it more often in music videos or in kids' TV, that kind of thing. It's quite a youthful way of filming. It doesn't happen a lot. So it's worth trying to notice when it does happen and working out why. If something has been desaturated, it's where the shot has had the colour drained out of it. And it doesn't have to be totally desaturated. There's obviously a spectrum or degrees in which you can do this. And you might have done it on your phone in photo editing apps. If you desaturate a shot a little bit, it's just a little bit less colourful than it was before. If you desaturate the shot totally, it end up going black and white. So it depends on how much desaturation has happened in a shot. But if it looks less colourful than it should be, it has been desaturated. Often used for making something seem old and traditional. If you want to show that somebody is weak or less vibrant or very boring, you might desaturate the shot. Sometimes they'll use desaturation if they're trying to make something seem like a dream or a memory or the past. Because it helps us to see the difference between present day and the dream sequence or the memory sequence. And sometimes desaturating something can make it seem more serious. So a black and white photo or a black and white moving image shot sometimes seems more serious than one that's in colour. A flashback or a flash forward is when the editor shows us something that happened either in the past or the future, obviously. And they will often use other editing techniques to make that clear. So, for example, you might have a fade to white or a fade in from white to show us something from the past or the future. You might use slow motion, you might desaturate it. So there's lots of ways in which the editor can make a flashback or a flash forward clear to the audience. Flashbacks and flash forwards are quite useful for giving the audience more information. So it helps us to understand the story or the narrative a bit more. It gives us some more of what actually has happened in the past to those characters or what will happen to them in the future. And that helps us to understand a bit more of the story. And it also suggests that the past or the future, depending on if it's a flashback or a flash forward, has some kind of importance to what is going on in the present. There's no reason why an editor is going to show you a flashback to the past if it doesn't bear any relevance to what is going on in the present in that particular story. So it's quite useful for showing the audience something important.
Another video editing technique, which is often used in films, TV programmes and other moving image products, is a montage. A montage is a collection of shots or scenes from a reasonably long period of time that are edited together to make time almost compress. The montage you're seeing at the moment on screen is from Pixar's Up. We see short snippets from their childhood, meeting for the first time, eventually getting married, building a home together, and then are being unable to have a baby, and then eventually resulting in Ellie's death. And this is the very beginning of the film. This allowed the filmmakers to compress 60 or 70 odd years of Carl and Ellie's lives into the first 2 minutes of the film. And it set up the audience to understand why Carl is the way he is. Montages are often used to show somebody developing or improving over time. So if you want to show somebody training, for example, to be a boxer, you might make a montage of all of their training that they do. So montages are often used to show someone or something developing or changing over time.
Visual effects. So these are sort of special effects or computer generated images. So anything where they've used, for example, green screens to create effects. Maybe they've created explosions using CGI, or they've used some amazing CGI technology to create somebody's costume or crazy makeup look that's going on. Maybe they've deformed them or aged them, or they've made it look like they're made of metal or fire or whatever it might be. Any kind of computer generated images comes under this term of sort of visual effects. They're quite useful for showing someone or something is exciting and powerful. They're good for making a scene dramatic, so you'll often see them in like action or sci-fi movies. And they're obviously useful for adding in things that were impossible to film in real life.
So that was my easy to understand guide to different editing techniques that you might find in unseen products. If you've got any more questions, just drop them below. Don't forget to hit subscribe, because I've got lots of other videos on my channel that are already there and that I'm posting soon about GCSE and A-level media studies.